In January, Governor Brown projected a $1 billion surplus in the state budget. Over the last few months, however, a surprisingly strong stock market, an improving housing market, and lower unemployment have resulted in $4.5 billion in unexpected revenues. Despite the good numbers, however, when the May revise capturing April's tax receipts came out, the administration told voters that weaker tax collections in the coming months would likely erode the vast majority of those gains. The nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, however, had a more positive assessment, projecting a $3 billion surplus. And in the crazy, complex, and volatile world of California state finance, such wildly different assessments are not that surprising. What is the basis for the different assessments by the governor and the LAO of California's fiscal health? And what are the implications for the upcoming budget negotiations? We'll ask Mac Taylor, leader of the state's nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, or LAO, veteran political columnist Dan Walters of the Sacramento Bee, and John Myers, political editor for News 10 in Sacramento. The May 2013 revise, a debate over restoring cuts versus holding the line.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Back in January, the governor projected a $1 billion surplus. And while the state has done even better, seeing $4.5 billion in new unexpected revenue, the governor's May revision, developed after April's tax receipts are counted, forecasts virtually all of it will be gone due to weaker tax receipts in the coming months. Our first guest is not so pessimistic. His office sees a $3 billion surplus going forward. Mac Taylor is head of California's Legislative Analyst Office, the nonpartisan source for information on state fiscal and policy matters. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, so let's get up to date. How have the governor's recent economic forecasts and revenue projections changed since January?
Well, I would say that his economic forecasts for both the nation and the state have really not changed very much. Some things got a little better, some things a little bit worse. Federal sequestration, the federal cuts can dampen the economy a little bit. But for the most part, we're about in the same place we were on the economy. But
what about your economic forecasts and revenue projections? How do they differ from the governor's?
Well, on revenues is where the difference is. The governor had a slight increase over our kind of budget window that we're now in of about $800 million, but he had increases in this current fiscal year we're in, but decreases in the next coming fiscal year. We came out with our report a few days ago, and we thought that there was going to be more money primarily for the 2013-14 fiscal year, which starts next July 1.
Why did you think that?
You know, it's almost all in the personal income tax, which is the state's primary funding source for our programs, and a lot of the differences in capital gains, a very volatile source of income.
Well, let's talk about that. The revenue outlook appears to be good, and it's based, indeed, even more based after Prop 30, on the volatile fluctuations you were talking about in the stock market and capital gains, and particularly of the wealthiest 1%. How big a role does capital gains play in the state budget?
Well, you mentioned the top 1%. Those people in good times can pay close to half of our personal income taxes, 1% of people. So it is highly concentrated. And for those people, capital gains is a very important piece of their income portfolio. Capital gains can be almost a tenth of our revenues. And most importantly, they can fluctuate up and down very dramatically. Most people have salary or wage income, and it doesn't change much from year to year. Capital gains can go up and down by large percentage terms.
There was a Facebook IPO a little while ago that people were staring at, was that going to impact the state budget? Just one IPO.
Absolutely. Or Google, someone from Google selling a lot of shares. When you're that concentrated, you almost have to look at those individual situations when you're doing revenue forecasts.
So how do you make forecasts then? How do you plan prudently if you're dealing with this very volatile source of revenue?
Well, it's made revenue forecasting very difficult, and we've had to let our bosses know in the legislature that there are large variabilities around that estimate, billions of dollars up or down. And there's a couple of things you can do. You can either look at your revenue structure and say, you know, we don't want to have a revenue structure this volatile. And that could mean that you treat capital gains in a different way, or you change other funding sources to lessen your reliability on personal income taxes, or you change your budget structure to acknowledge that volatility and prepare for it.
You know, I just want to make it clear, when you say bosses in the legislature, you don't respond to the majority party, you respond to all legislators.
I shouldn't use that term. I just mean the people who hire me.
Okay.
I work for all 120 members of the legislature.
Okay, I just want to clarify that. You note in your analysis that, quote, creation and bursting of asset bubbles has been a major contributor to California's revenue volatility. So with the recent gains in the stock market, are they sustainable, and will there be a market correction?
Well, if I knew the answer to those questions, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be on my own island counting my money. What we try to do is just look at various indicators to see if there's evidence of a bubble. And when we look at price-earnings ratios, capital gains to personal income, various indices like that, we're not seeing real concerns of a bubble as of yet. But who knows?
I want to ask you also about this $500 million loan that the governor is taking from the cap-and-trade auction and putting it in the general fund. Can he do that? Because I thought that money was supposed to be used for reducing greenhouse gases. And then the question, should he do that?
Well, this is a loan from, in effect, a new program, like the cap-and-trade monies. And the state can borrow from those funds. It has to repay them whenever the program needs it. So it is legally allowable. I think the question is, he's taking all the money from the fund. And so the question is, well, how can you have a program if you're not going to have any money there? So I could see where some people might have concerns with the proposal.
Okay, well, when we come back, a discussion of some of the largest near and long-term costs confronting the state government, the proverbial 800-pound gorillas of education, health care, and the state's long-term liabilities such as public employee pensions. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with California's LAO, Mac Taylor. Education gobbles up a lion's share of the state budget, between 40 and 50% every year. Prop 98, the state's guarantee for minimum level of funding for schools, is pretty important. In fact, the state's general fund is on the hook for any local shortfall. So you indicate that the governor has made significant funding changes for schools in the May revision. What are they?
Well, it's basically because revenues went up quite a bit in the current year. The school funding formula that we've adopted requires virtually all of that money to go to schools. And what the governor's proposed, we think wisely, is to set those additional monies in the current year for one-time purposes, paying off some prior deferrals or loans that we made with schools, and one-time spending related to implementation of the Common Core standards. So there's a large infusion of new monies. He proposes using them on one-time purposes, which we think is wise.
And the whole funding of education is a Byzantine structure. It's very, very complicated. There's something called the maintenance factor. Can you explain what that is and what the governor's proposing, and what do you think he ought to do?
No, not in one show.
I was afraid of that.
In short, basically school funding is supposed to grow with the economy. But in certain cases, when general fund revenues are not doing well, you can temporarily go below this line, but you have to work your way back up to it.
Okay.
That's the maintenance factor, that additional payment. And there's ambiguity as to how you pay that back. And we had a different approach that we thought was appropriate given the Proposition 98 funding formulas than the administration. But they adopted the administration's proposal. That requires a lot more money to go back in payments to schools.
And is there enough flexibility in Prop 98 to do that? To make those changes, or?
Well, I think what our concerns with the approach that the state has adopted is that in cases like this, all the money goes to schools, and frankly, the rest of the budget is even a little bit worse off.
Right. It's a ballot box budgeting. Prop 98 is a good example of that.
I think so.
What is your assessment on the governor's spending proposals for education?
Well, as we said, we think those are wise because he's treated it as a one-time kind of source of funding.
So he's paying off
paying off prior debts,
prior debts rather, and the Common Core, helping them get up to speed for the Common Core.
Right,
standards.
And there's not much of a difference in his longer-term funding. So, given his view of what the maintenance factor formula is in school funding, we think he's done a good job in setting priorities.
Okay, what about health and social services? That generally accounts for about 1/3 of the state budget. There's the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. What is the state on the hook for?
Well, the state's not on the hook for very much. In fact, the state could save in many ways to the extent that people are shifted onto health care. There may have been costs that both states and counties were picking up that now will be picked up through the whole health exchanges and through the federal program.
So the counties were picking up people that were indigent and didn't have insurance. Now they're going to be covered by insurance, so the counties no longer incur that cost.
And then there's the proposal to expand our Medi-Cal program, which provides insurance to low-income people. Currently, adults without kids basically are not eligible, low-income adults. And there's the so-called Medi-Cal expansion proposal, which would add these low-income adults to our Medi-Cal program. From a fiscal perspective, because the federal government is paying virtually all the cost in the near run, 90% of the cost in the longer run, we think that it's probably almost a fiscally neutral program to the state if we take some of the savings that the counties are going to realize to pay for our share of those additional costs.
My understanding is, as you said, it's 100% of the cost being picked up by the federal government for about 3 years,
Yes.
and then it shifts to about 90%.
So just that 10%.
Right. So what about these future surpluses that you're projecting? What reasons are there that they may not materialize?
Well, I think we've kind of alluded to them earlier, that the economy could go bad. You could have various external shocks, either from China, Europe, federal monetary policy. So there's lots of reasons why we could have a slowdown and state revenues could fall.
That's why they call it a forecast.
That's why it's just a forecast. The only thing we know about our forecast, it's going to be wrong. We just don't know which direction.
What about the state's long-term fiscal challenges? Things like CalSTRS, the teachers' retirement system, or the unfunded liability for state employee health care. What should be done to address those issues?
I think that those are really important points that we've tried to raise in the past, that these are obligations that we've already committed to people, and yet we don't have a funding source for them. And we think that the state really needs to address these liabilities. They're very, very large. They could be over $5 billion just for the two that you mentioned. $5 billion a year. And so we think the legislature, in thinking about their much rosier forecast that we've presented to them, should try to build in something to start addressing those liabilities.
What about a rainy day fund? Setting some money aside. How much money do you think first of all, should we have a rainy day fund? I'm assuming what you're saying
Absolutely.
we should. The question then is, how much should we set aside? 5%, 10%? How much?
There's no right answer to that, but in the past we've been lucky to have more than 1 or 2% reserves. Remember we talked about that volatile revenue structure? The best way, in my view, to address that is to have a large reserve, so that when the economy tanks, capital gains, income falls, you have a large reserve sitting there to cushion the blow so that you don't have to make large changes in your budget.
Well, that sounds like an interesting idea. I want to thank Mac Taylor, the California Legislative Analyst, for being here. When we come back, we'll talk about the politics of putting together a state budget with two veteran capital observers, Dan Walters and John Myers. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by some of the best political observers of state politics, John Myers, political editor for News 10 in Sacramento, and Dan Walters, a columnist for the Sacramento Bee. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
Well, John, was there an element of politics, you think, in the governor's cautious financial projections?
Politics and a budget? Unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, I think that all budgets are political in a way, and I think this one certainly seems to serve the governor's purposes in a couple of ways. First of all, it continues the narrative of frugality that Jerry Brown walked in with. I mean, whether it's his own personal frugality or the state's frugality he likes to talk about. And I think it helps him set a bar here that not only is fairly low, but gives him a lot of latitude to negotiate with the legislature. I mean, if the legislature wants to come back and spend more money, and we see the legislative analyst thinks there's more money out there, then the governor may say, great, well, what do I get on issue X, Y, or Z, like education, which we want to talk about in a moment. So I do think it helps him politically set the stage for an interesting month.
Okay, the governor being intentionally downplaying revenue to keep spending in check?
Well, I don't know if intentional is exactly the word. The differences between the administration and the legislative analyst have to do with taxes on capital gains by a handful of wealthy people. So it's basically one group guessing that the wealthy people will take their capital gains and do X, and the other people will say that there'll be capital gains to be taken and they'll do Y. And the truth is, no one knows. And so the governor takes the low end of the thing because it gives him, as John said, more maneuvering room. And it also fulfills a kind of an old capital thing. It's better to come in low on the revenue side and have a pleasant surprise on the upside later than it is to come in high on the revenue side and have a very unpleasant surprise on the downside later. And that was a lesson that Jerry Brown's very first finance director, a guy named Roy Bell, used to drive home all the time. It's better to be a little conservative on the revenue side because the outtake of that is much better for you.
So it's better to underpromise and overdeliver, I guess.
As in politics, right?
Right. Well, let's talk about the governor's where he's putting the money. K-12 education, John, like you talked about. The administration is stressing that, listen, 80% of the funding is going to be distributed solely based on the number of students, FTE. only 16% are going to be based on the number of English learners, low-income students, and foster children in a district called the Local Control Funding Formula, and only 4% will be distributed as a grant to those districts with 50% of those types of students, called the concentration factor. Kind of complicated, but what do you think? Do you think the Democrats in the legislature will go along with the governor's proposal?
Well, it'll be interesting, but let's set the stage just for a moment, if I can. I mean, what we're talking about here really is the governor's proposal to change some education funding, not change all education funding, which of course is mandated by Proposition 98, the voter-approved guarantee. This local control formula that you laid out, these percentages, has been talked about now for about 18 months or so with the Brown administration. Didn't happen last year. He's back on it this year. I think that there is democratic agreement that you need to do something about kids from low-income families and English learners. I think the question, as you obviously could tell where I'm going, is exactly what you do. I think that Democrats in the legislature aren't so thrilled with the percentages. They don't like this idea of these concentration grants. Their argument is if these kids are in schools that are in school districts that don't have a high concentration, well, they need just as much help. So why don't they get as much money?
Poor school in a rich district.
Yeah, they want the money to follow the students, I think. And, the governor has this very district-focused plan so far. I think so there are a couple of issues. Districts versus schools, where the money goes, and these concentration grants versus spreading more of that money to these kids all across the state.
Devil's in the details?
The devil's always the details, and this is actually an interesting thing because who wins and who loses in this? Who wins are the big urban districts like Los Angeles Unified, and small rural districts that have large numbers of Latino kids who don't speak English and are poor. Who loses out, relatively speaking, are the suburban districts. But the suburban districts have a lot of clout politically. They're the place where elections are won or lost, as in the suburbs. And you have a lot of suburban Democrats in the legislature now, and they don't want to do something that looks like they're shortchanging their own school district. So you have that kind of power play going on, so to speak. You also have to take into account that the whole education finance system is a mess, and everybody agrees that it's a mess. It's a mess not only because of these differentials of financing, but because so much of the money is tied up in categorical aids. And one of the other provisions of the governor's plan is to eliminate most, but not all, categorical aids. These are earmarked pots of money that billions and billions of dollars to get around the aid formulas that govern the rest of the money. I mean, it's a very complicated, it's been going on for 45 years now. And he wants to eliminate most of those. Well, the advocates for these various programs, these pots of money, are coming on the Capitol. They don't like their pot being folded into the big picture, so they're trying to get carve-outs for themselves. So that makes the situation even more complicated. And it's, can you overhaul school finance in California? Everybody says it needs to be done. Can it be done? It's a test of political will of whether the system can work in Sacramento.
I want to ask you a quick question. Only about 30 seconds left in the segment, Dan, about realigning county responsibilities for health and social service programs. Will the legislature go along with the governor's proposals?
Well, it's part of the larger equation of Obamacare and implementing Obamacare, because he wants to basically take the money from the counties that they're saving because of Obamacare and have them pay for something else, and it's part of this realignment. It's under the rubric of realignment and increasing local control, but it's really a kind of a financial swap.
Okay, well, up next, what about the restoration of those cuts to state services that occurred during the recession? And what about the possibility of new taxes? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Walters, columnist for the Sacramento Bee, and John Myers, political editor for News 10 in Sacramento. Well, Dan, there's a wide array of safety net programs that were eliminated or reduced during the recession. Some legislators want to see those programs restored or even expanded. The governor maintains, however, listen, there's no money to do that. So who has the upper hand here? The supermajority, democratically controlled legislature that can override a governor's veto, or the popular but frugal governor?
Well, forget about this override business. That's something that journalists get all excited about, but it ain't going to happen. Jerry Brown was overridden many times in his first stint as governor, but this is not going to happen here. The margins are thin. He's got other weapons. The Democrats are all on the same page. You know, it's not going to happen. So really, this is more conventional than it appears superficially. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on the Democrats from unions, from various constituent groups, people who advocate for social service and health care, that want to see some of the so-called safety net reductions restored. The governor said at the very beginning, 2 years ago, he said, these are permanent. This is a permanent retrenching. That's the word he used, retrenching, or a rebenching of the state budget down to a lower level. And that just doesn't sit well with a lot of people, particularly now that there's more money to play with, and they're putting on the heat. And it's a big cause among liberal Democrats, particularly those from cities, and the governor is being stubborn about it.
So, John, is the governor going to bend here? Do you think that some of these health and social service cuts are going to be restored, and if so, which ones?
Well, I mean, I think that this is the kind of funny to people out in the public, right? It's early in the budget dance, even though there's 1 month to go before June 15th, and the legislators don't get paid if they don't enact a budget now by June 15th. I would suspect that if you're Jerry Brown, you have no reason to commit to a lot of these other programs, even if they're small ones, even if you believe them, until you get to the budget negotiation and say, well, what do I get if you get that? I mean, that's the art of negotiating. I mean, if you look at a few of the things that we talk about, dental benefits for Medi-Cal patients, probably not a ton of money. There's probably money somewhere, depending on how you move these revenue numbers that we've been talking about. Mental health programs that the leader of the state Senate, Darrell Steinberg, has talked about. That one probably is a little bit more expensive, a little more complicated. But again, if you're the governor, sit down with the Speaker of the Assembly and the leader of the Senate and work out these particular moves rather than commit earlier in the year, in which case you have fewer things to negotiate.
I want to ask you specifically about the Medi-Cal reimbursement, the 10% cut, and the cut to the courts, the $200 million cut to the courts. What do you think the likelihood of either one of those happening?
Well, the reimbursement thing has been talked about now for several years. I mean, we started that whole thing during the pit of the budget problems and the recession. The courts have weighed in on that. The California Medical Association, others very powerful political players have pushed on that one. I think there's an interesting discussion there. The courts thing is another whole complicated thing. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars just in this last budget. The Chief Justice railing against the governor and the legislature. That one's popular, but that one's more expensive. And I do think at a certain point, the more expensive the ask, the more complicated the politics here. I mean, so even though the courts, as you and I know, people really feel, right? I mean, they go to file a particular lawsuit and they're told come back next year if it's civil or something like that. So these are deep impact, and we've got and what's fascinating is that, Dan is right. I mean, the governor basically said kind of get used to this. And at the same time, a lot of people saying this is not a way to live.
So talking about expensive projects, Dan, what about the political prospects for those high-ticket infrastructure projects like high-speed rail and the Delta Water Project? Have their political prospects gotten brighter because the state's improving fiscal situation has gotten brighter? I
don't think that they have a lot to do with the state's fiscal situation. The tunnel project's supposed to be paid for by water users. The rest of it would be paid for, the ancillary stuff connected to it would be paid for by a bond issue, which will have to be negotiated sometime between this year and next year. And the bullet train seems to be limping along. There's a trial coming up very soon about that, but that's kind of out of the legislature's hands right now. That's in a different realm. There's federal approvals they have to get. They have to get contract with the railroads. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on with the bullet train. But the budget probably isn't one of them.
But if I may say this really quickly, Mark, keep your eye on at least on the water issue and the Delta issue, because the leader of the state Senate, Darrell Steinberg from Sacramento, floated, no pun intended, this idea just recently that maybe there should be a legislative approval process for part of that, which would bring it back into the political realm. So we'll see.
We've only got a minute left in the show, so I want to get these two questions in quickly. First one I'll ask you, John, is about taxes. Particularly, there's this discussion about a tax on oil companies. Going to happen?
No, for two reasons. I don't think Democrats march in lockstep on the issue of taxes. And two, I think you've got the governor who's very leery, especially going into a re-election year, of the public's opinion. So.
Okay, Dan, I know this is a big issue for you, long-term fiscal issues, things like pensions and retiree health care. Seems like that sense of urgency has kind of drifted a little bit. Is that on the back burner or completely off the stove now?
Well, it is kind of on the back burner because they did some sort of a pension thing last year, and they said, well, we've done that. We don't have to do anything more. But the fact is it's still sitting out there. The state teachers' retirement system says it needs $4.5 billion more a year to remain solvent, and that's not being addressed in this budget. That's one reason why it's really not a balanced budget. And there's another $60 or $70 billion unfunded liability for retiree health care that's not being addressed, both of which are being brought up by the Legislative Analyst's Office. They are being nags about the thing, but everybody's kind of ignoring it because it's a big ticket item and nobody wants to do it.
I'll leave on that note. I guess there's still there's still some bills to pay. Well, I want to thank Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee and John Myers, political editor for News 10, as well as the state's legislative analyst, Mac Taylor, for joining us. If you want to stay up to date with local and state politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
With the release of the governor's May revise, it set in motion the last stages of the annual posturing between the executive and legislative branches. Noticeably absent from this year's public posturing were any serious counter-proposals from Republican leaders. They were rendered powerless by the passage of Proposition 25 in 2010, which changed the two-thirds vote requirement for passage of the budget to a simple majority. Prior to Proposition 25, budget hearings in May and June led up to the closed-door meetings of the Big Five, the governor and 2 legislative leaders from each party. Since the 1980s, gridlock was the norm as the Big Five could not bridge partisan differences over how to deal with funding shortfalls and even budget surpluses. With unified control of government, that is, Democrats control both the executive and legislative branches, and a majority vote requirement, those gridlock days are likely over. The last 2 years have seen budgets adopted before the start of the fiscal year on July 1st. Instead of those partisan budget battles of the past, the conflict has now found a new home with Democratic leaders attempting to push their own set of priorities. This year's conflict between Governor Brown and Democratic leaders is likely to revolve around the policy wonk topic of revenue assumptions. In the May revise, the governor scaled his revenue assumptions back from his January proposal, while the legislative analysts, the legislature's nonpartisan budget advisor, projected another $3 billion in additional revenue. While this may seem like a trivial matter, these assumptions may mean the difference between the state restoring program cuts of the past to health and social welfare services or taking a more cautious approach and setting aside any new revenue for the economy's next recession. Given the mandates dictated by Proposition 98, the state school funding formula law, and the power and influence of education interest groups, nearly all of the additional revenue may go to K-12 education and community colleges. Democratic leaders in the legislature appear eager to use the more optimistic revenue estimates to justify more program spending. But we've seen this situation before, and it is one of the main reasons California plunged into the structural deficit of the past decade. 1 year of potentially strong revenue growth does not make a trend or justify spending for ongoing programs. The governor, who usually advocates a cautionary approach, will have to resist the siren song of permanent spending that overwhelmed Governor Gray Davis over 10 years ago. Instead, any unanticipated revenue, to the extent allowed by Prop 98, should be used to pay down the wall of debt accumulated over the years, support one-time spending, and build a healthy reserve. Although the state's finances are brightening, California still has a long way to go before it is on solid fiscal ground. I'm Jeff Cummins for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.